program allows you to support creators and streamers with those little coins that you are provided with the moment you join in. So remember to toss a coin to your snakeman if you can. Yeah, I would really appreciate it. But now that this is covered, let's go to the main point, and let's introduce today's guest, which, wow, I mean, honestly, with her, I never really know where to start, because I mean, she is a professional wildlife photographer, renowned conservationist, and she's also making big steps in journalism as well, alongside recently founding her own safari and wildlife travel tourism company. So let's give a warm welcome to our guest of today, Alice Péretié from France. Well, yeah, I mean France
Hi,
and
Lorenzo.
England as well. I never know how to say it, to be honest. But so thank you for being here, Alice. It's a pleasure.
Hi, Lorenzo. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction of yours.
Yeah, no, I
And
did.
well, hi to everyone who's joining in as well. It's really cool.
Yeah, so yeah, at least let's go right in. So like I said, you are French, but you've lived in London for a long time now, so much that you actually like to call yourself a French Londoner. At this point, I gave up trying to understand exactly what it means. Um, but so your life has been inextricably tied to Africa since, well, the very beginning, since the very beginning of your career, so to say. So to the point that right now you even, like I said, have started a company focused on ethical and sustainable safaris in the African continent, together with your partner Andrew and his brother. So let's start from there, because the company is called Odysseia, and that is already a word of its own. So I've already talked enough. The floor is yours. Please describe to us what Odysseia is and how it came to be.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Really appreciate it. So I'll start from the very beginning, but it also starts with why I'm so tied to Africa. But I will make it very brief. But I fell in love with Africa about 10 years ago when I went on a road trip with my mum and my brother, and I just knew from that point on that I wanted to be involved in conservation, and that I wanted to tell stories. So fast forward 10 years later, we've just launched Odysseia, which is the Greek word that gave the word the Odyssey, which is, as probably a lot of you know, the song composed by Homer many years ago. And it's one of the foundational texts for Western civilization, literary texts. And it's a text that's so full of symbols of coming home and moving away from hubris and all the darkness of war and rage and anger, and slowly stripping yourself down to coming home. And we just thought that that was so beautiful, to kind of come home to yourself as Odysseus comes home. You know, he ends up washed up naked on the shores when Nausicaa finds him, and there's nothing left. And you find that often when you're in nature, that reveals you reveal yourself, because you are back home. So there's a lot of play on the symbolism of what returning to your home means, whether it's to yourself, to wherever you feel right. And on the topic of being a French Londoner, the notion of home has always been a bit weird for me, because I'm French, but I've never lived in France. I'm London, but I'm from London, but I'm not British. So this idea of home and identity is something that's always been quite important to me, in the sense that I don't really know. And I think that I love exploring this notion, and I hope that our guests also will understand the philosophy behind it. I'm certainly going to make sure that we do it as poetically as possible. And then Odysseia was also, Andrew's a guide, his brother Paul's a guide, I'm training to become a guide. There's a love for the wilderness that is huge, and a love for conservation as well, for protecting the wilderness, and not even the wilderness, because as you know, Lorenzo, I'm a firm believer in saying that the wild is also within us, and it's wherever we look. It's just we have to look for it. But in the sense that we are losing biodiversity at a huge rate, and well, we want to be able to support that. And traveling traveling doesn't necessarily have a huge, a very positive impact on the environment. So we also try to give back wherever we can to minimize that. So Odysseia's logo is a triangle, it's a Greek capital letter delta, and there's three pillars: safari, art, and storytelling. Safari, art, and conservation, and art and storytelling are intertwined. So there's the safari side of it, where we organize trips for people, but we also host trips, be it creative workshops or just safaris. We bring guests out to the field. There's an online learning platform where we teach photography and storytelling, and we help people get in tune with their own creativity. And then there's a creative consulting side to it, where we create content for organizations in conservation or lodges or whatever. And it can be anything from just taking photos for them to coaching them on how to create content so that they don't need us, because eventually we want to create something sustainable where organizations can create their own content. They have the power to tell their own stories, and they don't need external support. So yeah, it's a lot of things, but it all intertwines, because we've kind of seen with the last 2 years that travel can just disappear like this. So we still need to survive as a company, hence the online tuition. As much as we love teaching, I mean, you know me, I've been teaching for years, and it's something that the connection that you get with people is so wonderful. And it's really not just about sending someone on safari and that's it. It's more, what can you get out of this safari? And maybe if we're talking on an online course, and then you want to go to Africa to apply everything that you learn, like everything feeds in itself. And as a passionate philosopher and classicist, I just think that reconnecting with the cultural side of what makes us human is really powerful, especially at a day and age where there is so much guilt about being human. There is so much rejection of humanity. I think that there's so much beauty there as well. And it was a very, 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 it's a French word that comes to mind, like a supported decision to choose a Greek name for the word. When a lot of people said, why are you not finding an African name? Why is it's got nothing to do with Africa? But actually it's got to do with humanity, and it's got to do with finding beauty and coming home. And for me, and for Andrew as well, and Paul, that's something that's huge for us. So yeah, in a nutshell, and then the conservation side of it quickly, basically we partner with lodges that have super, super transparent conservation missions, that do something that really give back, because anyone can be an eco-lodge today. You just have to put the label and say, we're donating to some community. So that for me is really important. And for every trip, for every guest that travels with Odysseia, we donate $50 to rewilding projects in Zambia and Malawi. So it'll help plant around 50 trees, more or less. And they're both projects that are really, really, really well organized, making sure that the trees actually grow, and it's not just a seedling that gets eaten by a goat. In Malawi, Root to Fruit has an 85% growth rate, which is huge. And it's also about educating the communities to not cut down the trees. So now there's a desire for these trees to grow, and for this whole project to work that is community-based, which is great. And then in Zambia, it's about rewilding and working with farmers to reduce the cattle herds, and to work together rather than everyone having large herds of cattle, and then trying to find where we can work in a place where there's both wildlife and people. So really exciting. It's a lot, but we want it to grow. I mean, we want this to be the project of our lives, really, and to work in the safari industry, in the kind of marketing, but more storytelling industry, and then just teaching and helping people to find themselves through their creative self. So that was a very, very long introduction, and I'm so sorry, but I'm really bad with doing short intros, and Odysseia is so big in my heart that it's just really hard to cut down on it. But yeah, more or less, that's the principle.
Like if it were up to me, I'd let you go on for hours on end. Of course, like we can't do that, but still, you touched on so many crucial points that yeah, I'm not even sure like where to start. Although one thing probably, since we were talking about that point where Odysseus is basically washed up on a shore, butt naked, and is found after a shipwreck where every single one of his companions died. That is not part of the tours. That is not the kind of tour that Odysseia offers people. So don't get scared. At least not that I know of. Like
No,
maybe
maybe
the
people
idea
want that.
is on the table, but um,
No, very metaphorical. It's an image for the fact that, I mean, to be honest, the last few years for me and for a lot of people around me has brought a lot up to the surface. And there's been a lot around me of depression, of not feeling well and feeling very anxious, and when you're in these dark parts, you grow, but there's also this feeling of having to go through the process of being naked and just starting again. And for me, the Odyssey is with each monster that Odysseus faces, or with each encounter, or the fact that he's shipwrecked, he ends up with no one else, only his bare self. I think that that's quite powerful in the fact that, there's always, as you strip along the superficial, you get closer to yourself and you can find happiness again. You can find, as like I said, the home. And it's something that's really deep, and it's something that I'm going to make sure to write throughout our newsletters, our blogs, the little, we give guests a little package, little welcome package, and that these little things will be there, not kind of fun and lighthearted, but just a way to open minds up to different perspectives and different ways of looking, really, when everything goes dark.
yeah, and along this line, no, I completely I completely see what you mean there, and it also reminds me of another like big aspect, important aspect of the Odyssey, which, as you know, I love to bits. I mean, I've been reading that book since I was literally not much older than a kid. So, and I absolutely adore it. And so you mentioned also like how this that work was so much of a cry against yeah, the atrocities of war, and a longing for peace, and a way to escape all the chaos in the world. And when it comes to conservation, I think we can draw an interesting parallel there, because just like, for instance, when we think about ancient classical culture, we picture like these scenes of like heroes going bravely going into battle, and all that, this romanticization of the, is that even a word? I don't know, I don't care,
It is.
of the of those times. And even with conservation, like you can turn on your TV and watch a documentary about, I don't know, the Serengeti or the Kruger, where everything looks like heaven on earth, and you see someone there, you see the host like standing on a rock, like watching elephants in the distance, like um, yeah, talking about how marvelous nature is, and how amazing it is to be able to protect it. But that's just not it. And I'm saying this because I've heard it from people like you, people who actually live that reality day by day, and see what is really behind the sugar coating of like the mainstream media. Because there is so much pain, so much struggle, so much poverty involved in the whole conservation world. So how do you plan to also bring that forward in a way that, of course, doesn't deter people from engaging with conservation, but still to at least bring it to light, so that everyone at least sees what things are really like?
Yeah, I think because you mention it, it's worth giving a few examples, or explaining a little what you've just said, and then I'll answer the question in how we will bring that in. So conservation is hard. I mean, there's so many different perspectives, and the reason why I started doing what I was doing, which was trying to communicate conservation, was that when I was studying, and I studied a degree that was multifaceted and that was interdisciplinary, and I created my own degree at UCL, and it was interesting because there I was sat with biologists who, you know, were very kind of, the world is just getting destroyed, we need to do something, capitalism is bad, etc. And then I'd go into an economy class, and it was a very flipped perspective, and I was just sat there thinking, I wish these guys talked to each other, because, you know, on one side, the system has enabled education and the development of R&D and research and incredible techniques, incredible science, and at the same time we are causing irreversible damage on the planet. So, you know, it's these two extremes. And I realized that there was an issue with how people perceived conservation in the circle around me. People would say, but Alice, how do you justify sending money to support lions when kids are dying of hunger? And then on the ground, there was this, in many countries that had suffered from conservation, because conservation was a colonial, development, like it was imported by British colonialists. There was this association to land grabbing, to eviction, to pain, and so there was a lot of refusal of what of the conservation, which leads to poaching, which leads to, you know, people wanting to survive as well, because then that's another facet. You know, not all hunters are poachers, but because of colonial rules saying, well, today you can't hunt lions, even though, oh, well, not lions, that's the wrong example, but bushmeat, because hunting's now illegal. How do people survive? So all these intricacies of the different perspectives of conservation, I wanted to challenge, and I just thought that photography was a nice way to start a conversation. Now, it's difficult because it's very hard to, now conservation has reinvented itself in a way that, and it still is because it's not everywhere, but you know, when you support conservation, you will support community development. You will support building schools, sending kids with bursaries, hospitals, roads, infrastructure. It is using tourism as a way to fund it, which in itself is quite an interesting model. And then you look at when COVID happens, there's no tourism, well, suddenly everything kind of falls away and poaching increases because people need to survive. And as you mentioned, the poverty, and it's true, when an elephant raids your crops and you have 10 kids to feed, well, you don't want that elephant to be there. And so it's so easy from a Western perspective to say, well, we've got to protect wildlife so that tourists can enjoy the beauty of nature. And it's true, there is a spiritual association to being in nature. It's beautiful. But I think it was John Muir, who had been very criticized for trying to protect, well, he'd been criticized by anthropologists because he wanted to protect a national park, and it was either economic, there would either be economic gain from destroying the park, or there was just spiritual gain from leaving it there because nature is our temple. And it's two schools of thought that are really difficult to reunite, because on one side, it's privileged to say, well, we've got to protect nature for what it is when people are dying of hunger. But on the other, if we destroy nature, then what does it say for the long term? So there's all these really complex intricacies. And when, for instance, last year I was working in Malawi for a few months. And Malawi is where I really, really gained consciousness of the mission ahead. In some countries where there is space, you'd think, okay, it's fine, these projects, they're working really well. And it's true. You go to northern Kenya, no rhino poaching in 5 years on the Lewa Wild Conservancy. Communities are really involved in conservation. They've seen the benefits, they feel it. Same for Namibia. You go to Malawi, one of Africa's it's Africa's poorest country, one of the densest populated countries in Africa, where you literally have village, fence, park. You don't have the space you can't afford an elephant to get out of the fence and trample villagers. So that really gives you an idea of the issue, because when you're in the park, the elephants are destroying it because they're nomadic animals. They're not meant to be in a relatively small fenced area, and normally they migrate to Mozambique. So how do you deal with this? And to be honest, I don't really have the solution, but what I do know is that there's incredible organizations that are working so hard and so tirelessly to be able to do that. And so what we do is we first of all highlight these organizations. We support them wherever we can, either with stories, covering them with stories, or producing content. And then if guests want to, go on conservation-driven adventures, or if they want to see, because it's very easy when you land in the Masai Mara, for instance, you fly over, you don't get a sense of the reality. You don't really see the villages. You don't really see the issues. So you have this romantic idea of Africa, as you were saying, Lorenzo. But it is possible, like if you were to drive through Zambia, for instance, you want to go to the Kafue National Park, you drive from Lusaka to the Kafue, it's about 5-hour drive. You're going to drive through a lot of poverty, and you're going to drive through, you just see another reality that I think is important to see. So it is something that we do discuss with guests. I mean, if it's something that they're willing to do, but obviously it's not something that you can force upon someone. But some of the places that we work with, actually all of the places that we work with at the moment, have community projects or are involved, or they'll ensure that people from the community can also come to the national park and enjoy, and then they'll do talks. Like there's these bonds with the communities that are formed, which are necessary, and they often do community visits where guests can go and see. And for me, that's one of the best ways, because at the end of the day, people are what matter. I mean, wildlife matters, life matters, but you form connections with people. You form very emotional connections with people and they will form emotional connections with you as well. And it's with kindness, it's with love, it's with compassion, it's with helping each other out that you will probably be more efficient in your conservation work than if you enforce rules and if you prevent people and you shoot them, or it's really difficult. And me saying this means that, there is armed conflict going on to protect nature, but wherever possible, having a positive relationship with communities is crucial. And it is something that we definitely support, and that if people want to see, then they're very much encouraged to.
Oh yeah, and I like that continuing on this line. I mean, you mentioned John Muir, and you mentioned it before in your introduction how you received criticism for. Didn't know about this, but it ties in very nicely with what I'm about to ask. So I'm happy you mentioned it, for not choosing like a name that immediately related to Africa for your new enterprise, and instead going for a Greek word. So I mean, yeah, like you said, yeah, conservation, at least for a very long time, the conservation has been conducted on colonial grounds, mostly like first from the British, and now even now many argue that the neoliberal conservation model, so based on tourism and trophy hunting, is very much derived from John Muir's vision and the North American model, basically. So no longer European, but still not African either. And again, you mentioned the matters of namings and using, and how much even words matter. So how in your experience, and also as a foreigner trying to contribute to conservation and to insert yourself in this reality, what is your vision on like how local leadership is developing in terms of conservation, and how the perception of who should be in charge and who should contribute more than be in charge, is changing both in Africa and and outside of it as well?
That's a really difficult question, but I will do my best to answer.
Oh yeah, you know me by now. I mean, if you were expecting easy questions, I mean, honestly.
Why did I even come? So there is so much hope for local leadership, but from what I've seen, and again, this is only from what I've seen, and to be honest, the research that I've conducted as an academic when I was writing my thesis on community-based conservation, in the vast majority of cases, actually in all of the case studies I looked at, conservation projects, at least the old ones, maybe now you do get local projects that are initiated by local community members, are imported or initiated by foreigners. And, my partner and his brother are Zambian. They grew up in Zambia. And it's the same. Like the people who initiated the projects that they knew of were mostly white Zambians. So again, this is a really difficult topic because the identity, like what I was talking about home earlier and not knowing where home was, for white Africans, I think that the topic is quite difficult to touch upon as well. But it's difficult because from a legal standpoint, the majority of board members will be local, because you can't really set up an organization and not have local members, obviously. But to give you an example, when I wrote my thesis on community conservation in Kenya, so the project I looked at was 100% Maasai owned, 100% Maasai run, and 100% Maasai built. It was a tourism project that communities of Maasai had put together, but it was instigated by the neighbouring conservancy called Lewa Wildlife Conservancy, and the owner was a white Kenyan. So I think that there is, and to an extent, I don't know if that is colonialism, because it benefited the Maasai to do these things. And it's just that these methods that have been applied to try and, bring biodiversity back they are Western methods, but they are scientific methods in the sense that, Maasai aren't conservationists, and it's something that I learnt when I was interviewing a few Maasai. They're not natural conservationists. In fact, they would hunt as part of their rituals to grow through the ranks of Maasai culture. And one of my friends, who's a Maasai warrior, he's the most wonderful human, and he said, when I was younger, if there were animals, I would chase them, elephants, lions, because I had to protect my cows. And there was this movement, so the Maasai would live, I would say coexist with wildlife. They'd follow the rain, so that the great migration pattern that you'd get in the Maasai Serengeti, the Maasai would follow that. And then with colonialism, the parks were created and the Maasai were evicted. So then the problems start because suddenly you have a lot of people on the same land with cows that aren't moving anymore. And that's how the biodegradation begins. And then the kind of focus around wildlife, sometimes it was there. I mean, you'll find many tribes that have cultural associations to wildlife and to preserving wildlife, more the balance of wildlife itself. But that also gets lost a long time because the culture has evolved in a way that's like, well, you go to the city or, your culture adapts to the situation. So in that sense, the initiative of we should be conserving X piece of land doesn't come necessarily because it's not a priority, because actually you're in competition with wildlife in terms of your crops, your cows, the land. So it's difficult to say it's difficult to answer that question in that sense. But what there is now is that there is so much local leadership that is possible, because now that these projects are there, they're kind of like a base for local ideas to be promoted, and there's few organizations that actually will actively look to kind of bring these local ideas to light and support them. And I think that that's what we should really be focusing on as well, is how if 20 years later these conservation projects that were imported either by colonialism or by local people who were the kind of heritage of colonialism, if I can say, how have these methods transformed into local culture? Has it been adapted? And in some areas, yes. You go to northern Kenya now, because there's been so many benefits in having the wildlife return, and more than instrumental benefits. This same man who was saying, I used to chase the wildlife, and he then said, but now I rather look at a herds of elephant than look over my cows. I mean, for a Maasai to say that when the status of the cow is so important in Maasai culture, it's huge. So I think that it's a long-term thing, and now is where we're looking at if it bears fruit. Last year, I was working on an article for an organisation called Chingeta Wildlife, and it was about the pangolins in Central African Republic, and the local tribes. So there was Baka, Bantu tribes that we were looking at. They of course they were horrified when they understood, because extinction wasn't. It's a foreign concept. There was no idea of extinction in these societies because there never was something like extinction. So when anthropologists kind of sat down and explained the idea of why they had to, a pangolin is a staple food for them, why they had to maybe try and not hunt them was because, well, they couldn't say it's extinct because it didn't mean anything. So they said, imagine if it's finished, how would that feel? And they were horrified. So you see, it ranges, there's so many diversity, there's so many tribes, it's so difficult to look. Some tribes really, it doesn't matter to them, but others it does because they rely on the ecosystem, but also because they want to, in the Bantu, it said in the interviews that they wanted their grandchildren to be able to see pangolins because that was what they had experienced. So there's this idea of transmission as well. And then you go to Mali and there's many tribes that have cultural beliefs associated to elephants as having to protect them because they bring good fortune and because they're majestic creatures, etc. So it's hard to say because there's no one answer fits all, but it is true that from what I've seen, the majority of conservation projects were, foreign. That said, the point of these conservation projects is, of properly constructed ones, is to ensure that there is, some kind of there's no dependency on the initial bringers of the project. So if they left, that's what Chengetta's ideas were. The day they leave, the project, the benefits and the kind of wheels of the project should be able to work by themselves. And you would have this restitution. I don't even know if it was there in the first place. That's why it's difficult, because in some cultures you probably didn't have a connection to nature. You lived in it, but you probably hunted. Others had a more spiritual connection to nature. It's very difficult to say. But what is happening now is that there is definitely a movement to create these spiritual connections to nature as much as these instrumental benefits to nature, of having nature and connections to nature. Yeah. I don't know if that responds to your question.
No, yeah, it absolutely does, at least to a good part of it. But then I'm going to get to the next one in a second. Just wanted to mention for everyone in the audience that absolutely feel free to ask questions to Alice in the chat, or even just shoot your ideas, your opinions on what we are discussing, because this, especially for this interview, I would say it's something that I think would help a lot, like hearing more perspectives and ideas on these topics, because like you said, Alice, it's extremely multifaceted and nuanced, and there's no like one clear-cut answer for one size fits all answer there.
And I just wanted to add, just thinking about it, there's a few examples actually, few tangible examples that I thought I'd mention of where local leadership has really come into place, and it's beautiful. I speak of Kenya because that's what I studied, so I have more tangible examples, and actually in Malawi too. But there was a pilot who sadly passed away last year. He was one of Kenya's top pilots. I think he was from he was from the outskirts of Nairobi, and I think his mum one day took him to an animal orphanage, and he was mind blown. And if I remember his story correctly, I'll need to check, but his name was Ian Lemayan, and very local, very Kenyan, and he just had an incredible smile, and he dedicated his life to conservation. He the minute he walked into a national park, he wanted to be a ranger, and then he wanted to be a bush pilot, and his dream was to create a pilot school for local Kenyans, for kids to learn and to be passionate about conservation from a young age. And sadly, he passed away in a terrible plane accident. But his wife did a fundraiser, and they've been able to sponsor the first, the first child to go through that training. So that's one really incredible example of local leadership. And then another one, when I was in Malawi, I met a guide. I met many fascinating guides, and I could tell you stories all night, but one of them called Danger, who from a young age wanted to look after vulnerable children, and he became a guide to be able to pay for his dream, and now he looks after 175 orphans around Liwonde National Park. And he is also super passionate about, educating local children about the necessity of planting trees, about the necessity of caring for the environment. And so part of his feeding and learning centres, because it's for kids aged 2 to 5 that are orphans or vulnerable, Teaches them how to count, how to everything. It's like it's preschool in Chichewa and in English, and he really communicates that passion for the environment. So there are so many local projects actually that are there that you probably don't really know, and it's just really beautiful to see.
Oh yeah, thank you for thank you for mentioning that, because indeed I can imagine this is definitely like you said. There are so many people, so many projects to mention, one way or another. Unfortunately, that yeah, it would take so long, but still it helps to at least add a specific name, a specific location to the discussion, so that it doesn't sound like we're just like talking some abstract stuff. No, this
Exactly.
actually happens.
Yeah.
This exists. This is real. So thanks for that.
I
And
just,
on
I
the
just one last thing,
oh yeah, sure.
Lorenzo, because this question is a really complex question, but I also think that, it's actually quite beautiful to look how people are collaborating, because it's not just a one kind of, oh, this project is better because it's a local project or anything. It's actually interesting to see how there's a synergy of knowledge as well, from local indigenous knowledge or local community knowledge with another kind of knowledge of how to manage an organization and how to, all of these things. Like the maths I learnt from Ian Craig, because he helped them. He had nothing, they were the managers, but he helped them. And I think that there's this idea of being able to work together, which I think that triumphs, wherever you come from, because it's all for the good of the environment. And I think that's really beautiful. And in fact, projects like those really make me smile, because seeing people who are able to put any kind of cultural difference aside just to work together and create something incredible, I think is great. And to be honest, we wouldn't be able to go very far if we couldn't collaborate. So yeah, that's my concluding note to that question.
Oh yeah, no, and it actually serves perfectly to introduce my next point, together with David's remark that yeah, science and the scientific approach seems important wherever you are. I couldn't agree more, definitely. But yeah, since you also mentioned about the role of education and the scientific roots of many of the supposedly foreign conservation strategies that are employed in Africa. I mean, this I'm going to say this, and this I know for sure. I know firsthand, like you do. Scientists are absolutely shit at dealing with people.
Yes.
That is a fact. And
And
so
of all boards, I met a Kenyan scientist who was so anti-people, and I love him to bits. But he was just, and he was just like, we should just nuke the world. That's
yeah, no,
so it's a universal. Well, the thing is, the more you learn about people and the impacts of on the environment, the more you will probably hate them. But we also have to remember that we are also animals and the product of our environment, and we're a species that has just survived and thrived exceptionally well. So it's it's hard.
yeah, no, and I was going to ask you, since yeah, for scientists have this tendency like to yeah, not listen, very, to put it bluntly. So you, at least, well, now it's definitely changing, and I'm not, I don't want to slander anyone or any specific category, but for the longest time you had like scientists going for field research in yeah, the tropical belt, or at least like underdeveloped countries, for lack of a better term, and yeah, basically act as if they were they were disseminating knowledge, and everyone had to listen to what they said without a word, basically, disregarding any perspective that wasn't their own, because it was supposedly not science, and all that. So did you ever have to face something, or at least witness something like this in your work in Africa? And how do you think it might have influenced like the negative perception of conservation science, specifically in this case?
Well, I remember when I was doing research for my thesis, I came across a topic in Tanzania of a lot of people a lot of locals who considered that conservation was land grabbing and it was an excuse for land grabbing. And then a lot of, so obviously, it was hard for them because and it happened in many parts of Eastern Africa where conservation, not Eastern Africa, sorry, Eastern and Southern Africa, where the British Empire was doing business, and a lot of tribes were displaced in the creation of parks, even in Liwonde National Park, which was also established in part by Chief Liwonde. It was not just South African warden. I think there was a story with a chief who agreed to the creation of the park, but it also meant displacing people. It's hard, in the name of science, you have to leave your home. You have to leave everything you knew, go to a foreign place that's not your home. And the land, the attachment to the land is quite an important thing in many African civilizations. And then when I was, the conservation science 200 years ago was that when the Brits arrived in East Africa and they saw people living with wildlife, they instantly published scientific reports on how the cattle and the people were damaging the wildlife, and so you had to create parks to remove all people from the environment. But that created terrible imbalances because suddenly all these people had to go somewhere, and so they were put in other places where the wildlife suffered terribly because there's a grazing competition, there's obviously people going to protect themselves from wildlife. So the arrival of, there's many papers that argue that the arrival of colonialism caused more imbalances in the ecosystem. Others say, and it's just different perceptives in science. Others say that if there hadn't been these measures in place, then there would be no wildlife left. And when you look at population growth, you wonder if down the line maybe that's true, because you look at areas like West Africa, where there was no conservation put into place because they were French colonies and the French didn't really care much for it. The wildlife is pretty sparse. So it's these two schools of thought of fortress conservation versus, and even now fortress conservation, some people still are advocates for it, obviously in a way that supports communities, but in a way where you kind of just have to let the ecosystem recover, so you can't touch it for years. Like, it's just, there's so many contexts and perceptions. But I think those are quite interesting examples of where science, which was conservation, it still is a hard science, but it's evolved into a very interdisciplinary topic. There's actually a lot of proof, especially in East Africa, that removing people from their environment and their habitat and putting them somewhere else and creating borders so people couldn't move anymore, which was to an extent embedded in the science over, but we need to create these parks and people can't be in the parks, created more damage than it did good. So the thing with science is that you'll be conducting experiments and you'll be going in one way for 50 years, and then suddenly someone will say, actually, that was a mistake, we've been doing it wrong all this time, and then new papers will come out. It's the whole point of peer reviewing. So it's hard to say that yes, it's right, but at the same time, science is only right in the sense that we fund, science is the product of funding. So if we spent all our money like researching something completely different with a completely different perspective, it would be very interesting to see what would come out of it as well. There's no right answer. We always think that we have the right answer in this era with science, but as you say, but then if 10 years down the line something doesn't work and we're like, oh, we should have done this differently because that actually didn't work. Like all those large scale top-down projects in the 20th century, building dams, etc. Now dams are proving to be a catastrophe for so many ecosystems and drying up lakes and stuff and causing major issues. But that was all grounded within science. So yeah, not a, again, delicate topic.
No, yeah, for sure, and especially also since the whole discussion about science going away to the forefront in the last 2 years because of the COVID pandemic and the role of science in getting us out of there and everything that happened in between. So which also was related to conservation, like you said, because the pandemic affected how conservation was performed, and also was funded very badly in many regards, like with the lockdowns and travel restrictions, which are also based in science. Of course, at least
Of
most
course.
of the times it can also get twisted and everything like everything can, but still, they were enforced for scientific reason. And then, yeah, of course, it had consequences for sustainability and for conservation as well. So yeah, it's also for us as scientists,
It's
it's also
confusing.
helpful sometimes to be able to confront our own limits and recognize that, of course, while science is probably the best answer that we have to so many issues, it's not the only thing that matters, indeed, like you said. Uh,
Yeah, and it was interesting because last year, so I was in London. I couldn't go out to Africa where I had some contracts, photographic contracts, because most of Africa was on the red list, on the UK red list, and I couldn't afford to hotel quarantine, and you weren't allowed to travel outside. I mean, there was a travel ban, etc. And it was just like, oh, you've got to save lives, and I was just like, well, it depends what you consider saving lives. You're saving lives of the country, yes, but I lost 4 friends in conservation last year who were fighting on the front line of conservation. So that's very, very. It's one way of looking at it, but then again, you and as you say, tourism. It's not a good model, but it wasn't meant to be. I mean, it's not a good model. It is a good model, but it wasn't meant to be forever. It's a short-term model, maybe medium, long-term model, and then the point is to create a self-sustaining system. I mean, at least for the projects that are ethical. And then you look at the impacts on the industries. I mean, it's a difficult one because poaching actually did skyrocket. During those times, because rangers couldn't be paid, and some rangers continued working for free. Even some of them they have holes in their socks. Their boots are destroyed, and they have to go day and night, pack of 25 kilos on the back, patrolling, protecting. The front line of nature conservation is not a pretty reality, but. I think it's important to just be mindful of all these things that are happening when we say we're saving lives. The perspective of it is quite important as well, for sure. And there's no doubt that we were. That's not what I'm saying, but yeah, depends how we look at it.
Yeah, and just as you like you mentioned it, I think it's also something that I wanted to ask you, but you already talked about it, also referencing what sadly happened last year to the founder and leader of Chengeta Wildlife, the organization that you mentioned before, and you worked with Rory Young, who was murdered in a what I don't hesitate to call a terror attack in earlier last year, I believe it was. And yeah, I really appreciated you also mentioned that from the perspective of even those who literally put their life on the line to for conservation from local foreign leaders like Rory, but also local rangers who are paid a pittance and have barely any like proper equipment, and they have to face poachers who sometimes are actually armed with military level like equipment and supplies, because wildlife trade makes a lot of money, and poaching especially makes a lot of money, which also means a lot of resources to arm poachers.
I think the wildlife trade is the 4th or the 5th most lucrative trade in the world, illegal trade in the world, after drugs, human weapons. And what Rory worked on, which was why I was so passionate about his work, was the point of convergence, which actually showed that the networks used by traffickers, whether they be drugs or human or weapon or wildlife, were the same, and they overlapped. And so he pointed to the fact that ivory poaching indirectly funded terrorism. And from my perspective, as someone who was trying to bring conservation to trying to make it tangible for people, because it's true. Like, how is African conservation in Africa meaningful to someone who's never been, who doesn't relate to it? And for the French, I mean, we've had quite a lot of terror attacks in the last few years, and for me, that was a really powerful way of saying, you know what, like, it is something you should be interested in, because at the bare minimum, it relates to your security. And yeah, it's awful what happened to Rory, because his work was groundbreaking, and we didn't have time to bring it to light before but I'm still very determined to keep that going, and one way or another get the message of support Chinguetta's message out, because that is an organisation that does it well. You know, it's rare to find organisations that work with anthropologists and scientists, and not just scientists, or not just people who have no academic background, but people who really understand the different complexities. And I think that organisations like that work in the shadows and that get the job done before they start talking about it, are really rare. So it was hard, because, you know, we saw, at least in the conservation world and the tourism world, we saw all these things that were happening, and at the same time, people here were losing their relatives, and so it was just a lose-lose situation. Like, there's just so much sadness and so much despair that it was hard, because it's very difficult to go ask for money and for support in these times, but at the same time, rangers, as you say, they're paid a pittance, because most of them are organisation-based who rely on donations to keep their rangers going. You look at government-paid rangers. You look at, in Malawi, I was looking at different national parks. You look at the parks that are managed by African parks, who do really care about their rangers. The rangers always have impeccable uniforms. They're well fed. They're great guys. I mean, they're all great guys, but they're happy to an extent. I didn't really go much into the psychology behind it. But then you'd look at national parks guys who, they're not well trained. And actually Malawi's a bad example, because Rory and Chinguetta trained rangers in Malawi in all 5 major parks for years, and the results were incredible. My mind was more pointing to Zambia. You look at the Kafue National Park, which is now an African Parks managed park, but before that, there was just no knowledge of proper practices. You know, ZAWA, which were the Zambian Wildlife Authority, the scouts would just flick matches in the bush and let it burn, because there's this idea that when the bush burns, it produces new shoots. Yes, to an extent, but that's only at certain times of years. Like, all of this ecological knowledge, which was just not applied because it wasn't known or it wasn't understood, and burning is very big in Zambia. You need this kind of training and looking after your rangers. It's exactly as you said. So yeah, those are really, really important topics to discuss. And it's hard, because people don't look at nature, the war that there is on the ground to protect nature, as a war. It's looked as something that's privileged, or that's, while technically it's for nature, it's not for human life, but it's still for life. Like, if we don't preserve these ecosystems, we're not going to be able to breathe very soon. Like, if the lungs of Africa, which are the Congo Basin mainly, those rainforests get turned into agricultural land, then it's one of the world's biggest carbon sinks. So there's just so much to address. And even me, I sometimes I don't know, because I'll talk to people around me. We'll have these great conversations, but it's true that it takes more than one individual, and that's why there's so many great conservationists out there who are also doing that. But I definitely think it's really possible that we can turn the tide, but I really think that we need to step up our level in terms of how we communicate, because if we shout, people don't listen to someone who's shouting. And to be honest, people don't really listen unless it hits them in the face. COVID, prime example, panic at the last minute rather than preparing a little in advance when there were the first whispers of COVID coming from China. Climate change isn't something new. It's been just talked about for 40 years. So yeah, I just hope that it doesn't come to the situation where we react in emergency, which, knowing human nature, probably will. But that's why, it's cool to see the next generation of conservationists, because they are all there and ready. And whether they're in Africa, all these kids whose bursaries, who were funded by conservation, they actually all want to give back to conservation because it gave them opportunities. So many young leaders of tomorrow are at school right now, and that's what we've got to focus on.
Well, yeah, I'm glad we ended on a hopeful note after I kept probably the worst the worst topic for last. And yeah, I mean, in in hindsight, probably I could have organized it a little bit better. But yeah, I think since there are no more questions from the audience, I would have loads more, but I also understand that yeah, time is not our friend, and for this reason, I think it's at least a good moment to bring our talk to a conclusion. So, thank you again so much, Alice,
Thanks,
for
Max.
being here. It was extremely insightful, like I knew it would be, and it definitely gave us. I'm pretty sure it gave us a lot of food for thought. For to use a term that I honestly hate. I don't like how that word sounds, but still the concept stands. And yeah, I of course we I wish you all the best for Odysseia and all the other projects that you're involved in. And for you for everyone in the audience, yeah, the Snake Man Slayer will be back in a very short time, very soon, with another guest. This time from a completely different background. I'm not going to disclose anything more now, but still, if you still haven't had enough of me, you are very welcome to tune in next time and subscribe to my Hubs channel for regular updates on when next episodes are going to air. So once again, thank you so much everyone for joining, and see you.